Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from M83, Fantasy. M83, Anthony Gonzalez and Company, we know them. Just a few months ago I finished doing an entire discography review of this well-acclaimed synth-pop and indie rock band. I've been a fan of theirs for a minute, probably first tried to get into them around 2015-ish sometime, but really became a full-on fan of theirs once their 2016 album Junk rolled around and I got to review that. While not every project of theirs is as big a winner as the next, they do have a lot of big gems in their catalog, my favorite obviously being their 2011 commercial breakthrough Hurry Up We're Dreaming, which both felt like it was going for an accessible 80s pop sound, but also really swinging for the fences and feeling like a risk through its massive double album structuring. And I firmly believe it also kind of started the wave of this kind of indie influence among EDM artists years later, with people like Porter Robinson and Madeon taking heavy cues from it. But they don't really have any bad albums out of the 8 they've already released either. Maybe I'm not as hot on the formless nostalgic noise blocks on Dead City's Red Season Lost Ghosts, but lots of people absolutely love that one and hold it up as their best. And albums like Before the Dawn Heals Us, Saturdays Equals Youth, their self-titled debut, the above-mentioned Junk, and their last album DSV2 are all really freaking good and I enjoy on pretty much the exact same border of greatness level while having completely different rationale for enjoying each one. Every album before this one has had its own sound and identity apart from each other while all still adhering to a signature sound that's easily recognizable as M83. If you want further details, you can obviously check out any of my previous reviews, all linked in the playlist in the description. So, obviously when I heard a new one was being announced, I was reasonably excited to hear what Gonzalez might have up his sleeve this time around. From the rollout, it seemed like Gonzalez was hoping to move away from the more commercial sounds that have colored some of his more recent work and more towards some of the rock-influenced sounds that color older albums like Before the Dawn Heals Us. It seems, in this band's long history of trying to recapture nostalgia for the days of being a teenager and lamenting the youthfulness you may have lost in every record they have released, it appears the band has finally been around long enough where Gonzalez has inevitably seen fit to mine M83's own history for nostalgia, really attempting a return to form that would hopefully appeal to the fans who were disappointed by the likes of Junk and DSV2, even going as far as to say that if you're only a fan for stuff like Midnight City, this album probably isn't going to be for you. In reference to the fact that the music here was a lot more open-ended and meandering and not quite as tight or catchy. Which I think may have gotten certain subsets of his fanbase particularly excited, and sure enough, after the album came out, I feel like I saw a lot more universally positive reviews from his core fanbase than those last two albums ever got. I admittedly wasn't going in expecting to enjoy this more than the last two myself, especially since I think both of those last two projects are underrated as hell and I entirely disagree with all the backlash they got. But I also really liked Before the Dawn Heals Us and was game for more material that sounded kinda like that. I went in expecting an album that maybe wasn't necessarily going to be great, but was almost certainly going to be really good. And I sat with it and listened to it in full the day it came out, and my first reaction to it was, man, that was the most tedious thing I've heard in a long time. Is that their worst record yet, or am I just not in the right mood for this? Thankfully, the latter turned out to be true. It did grow on me a fair bit on second listen, staying around the same level of enjoyment for all subsequent listens from there. I believe this album is quite solid and up to par with the baseline level of quality I would expect out of M83, but at the same time, something does still kind of feel missing for me out of this one. Something didn't quite click on as visceral a level as I would have wanted or go the extra mile for me in the same way that other projects of theirs could. It's not my least favorite project of theirs. I'll still put this above Dead Cities and DSV1, which again are perfectly fine projects as well. But I think that's about as far as I'd go. It's good, and it has its moments, but it doesn't really strike me as a gem on the level of the remaining 6 M83 albums. Part of that is just the new direction, if you want to call it that, which obviously isn't new at all. Not that it's pretending to be or that it was ever advertising itself as something new to begin with, but as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I liked the most about M83 was the fact that every new album of theirs felt different and like its own thing. This felt like the first one that wasn't. It just felt like a mix of ideas they'd already done before on their most well-acclaimed older work. It feels very safe by their standards. Now, that could be all well and good if they're at least able to do those ideas as well as they could in the past, and I think they were able to do that in at least a few moments here. But I think my initial outright negative reaction to the album might be the real clue as to what was missing. For as many good to even great tracks as this album has, it is not an easy one to get through from start to finish. All of these tracks are, again, at least pretty good, but the pacing of the album as a whole is very much not good. This thing is really indulgent and runs together a lot. Several of these tracks I would probably be into a lot more if I were able to take them out of context and judge them in a vacuum, but when taken into greater album context, only feel like I'm trudging through a lot of the same ideas over and over. Hurry Up We're Dreaming is a much tighter and breezier listen than this was, and that's an even longer double album with 22 tracks. Still, that's not to take away from the quality present in the tracks themselves here. I do think the album starts out really strong. I honestly think the intro cut, Water Deep, is legit excellent. The way it starts out with this melancholic solo acoustic guitar building into some of their trademark expansive synth builds, it feels very deep and emotionally resonant in all the right ways that I'd want new M83 material to be, and to such an extent that it's actually one of my most consistent favorites on the entire album. And that bleeds into the album's lead single, Ocean's Niagara, which, when I heard this one when the album was first announced, my thoughts were like, yeah, that is definitely a new M83 track, alright. It's nothing you haven't heard them do dozens of times over the years, delivering all the big 80s arena rock and washed out synth pop sounds that you probably already expect before even pressing the play button on a new album of theirs. But hey, the formula still works as well as it always has. The tune behind it is quite solid, and Beyond Adventure is probably the most memorable hook behind any of the tracks here. Though if you want something that feels more like an actual song instead of a standard epic M83 soundscape, there's the next track, Amnesia. I suppose meant to be the equivalent to this album what Reunion was to Hurry Up We're Dreaming. And while this track obviously isn't as good as Reunion, it does work in a lot of similar ways. A lot of standard 80s guitar textures and epic walls of synths. More of a coherent tune driving everything, and the tune is very solid once again. The verses on this one aren't anything special, and when the louder choruses hit, the vocals totally get drowned out and become indecipherable. Bit of a running theme throughout pretty much everything on this entire album, actually. But said choruses and any of the sections delivered by M83's latest female vocalist, Kayla Sinclair, do particularly soar anyway. Not that I really care about clearly hearing all the lyrics on an M83 album to begin with. On first listen, I'll admit this was where I started to get a little worried about the direction this album was taking, as I thought it blended in too well with what Ocean's Niagara started, and was pretty much the same kind of idea done again. A worry that only got exacerbated by more than a half of the track listing afterwards. But this cut was definitely a grower. I can see it becoming a particular fan favorite as well. Next there's Us and the Rest. That one's alright, I guess. Going for more of a slower ballad, like something that could have fit on like Pink Floyd's A Momentary Lapse of Reason. The tune and melody is fine, but the idea didn't really stick out to me. Even when the track really starts to explode at the halfway mark, it's still like a moment I knew was going to happen anyway than something that feels like it landed with as much consequence as it could have. And then Earth to Sea, ironically, was probably the only track here that I liked more on first listen than I did on subsequent revisits. At first, when this track came up, I heard the standard synth backdrop and straightforward drumming and found it to be inherently refreshing to hear a more electronic-centric cut to contrast the guitar-driven ideas that drove the previous cuts on the album. But it's really not that different from the norm of the album. There's still plenty of guitars utilized in similar ways to previous and later tracks, and while I like some of Gonzalez's harmonizing with himself in the choruses, the entire track does build up and pay off in a lot of the same predictable ways, and other tracks, especially later on in the album, are able to deliver similar ideas either in a more distinct manner or have better and more memorable tunes behind them. It's the prime example of a track on this album that I would like a lot more if I had to judge it out of context than I can get into as easily in the context of the track listing it's being placed in. Though then this chapter of the album culminates in the ballad Radar Far Gone, this album's equivalent to Splendor. And, well, again, not as good as that track, was still able to stand on its own as a consistent highlight. The more understated acoustic guitar and ambient synth approach mirrored a lot of what I liked about the album's intro cut, while obviously feeling like more of an actual song. And the fact that it was more toned down and subtle than most of its surrounding tracks allowed it to actually stand out in the track listing, a much needed breather moment for the album as a whole. And honestly, this opening 6-track stretch of the album that had been released as a pre-release EP is probably the least compelling stretch here compared to the even bigger epics to come. My hunger for something more electronic focused is fulfilled quite well by the following track, Deceiver, which primarily acts as like a slow-building synth instrumental, starting out with nothing but ambient synth layering and straightforward foot-tapping drumming for its entire first half before any guitars or vocals start to come in afterwards. And that's contrasted very well by the much groovier title track, combining its standard synth soundscapes with some more, I guess, disco-y bass lines, and surprisingly pretty MIDI pan flutes as accompaniment, going up next to one of the best hooks here, which isn't saying much more than saying the word fantasy over and over. It feels like a real, like, Claudia Lewis type moment for the album, and it gets me really excited anytime it comes up. Less so for the following track, Laura, which I suppose has another pretty good tune, some nice orchestral accompaniment in one quick part and a sax solo that you can barely hear at all. And it is one of the tracks where you can most clearly hear the lyrics if you care about that, but it's yet another track that just doesn't really stand out in greater context. I feel like I've already heard several tracks that deliver a similar idea to this one, and on first listen to the album, this was the moment where the project officially lost me altogether and I was ready to call it their worst one yet. It did grow on me a little as time went on, but it's still not really a favorite by any stretch. Much more of a grower, however, was the following track, Sunny Boy. At first, this cut had the same problem as something like Earth to Sea, where, yeah, it's kinda more electronic, but it didn't sound different enough from the mix the rest of the album went for without as strong a tune to back itself up. And while I still don't think this track has one of the better tunes, I think this one went over a fair bit better than Earth to Sea, since it has a lot more progression and feels like it's exploring a lot of different ideas and really takes you on a lot more of a journey over the course of 6 minutes. Starting out with its slow burn atmospheric rock intro that can maybe blend in the background a little bit, but bursting into this super triumphant blend of light and joyous synth arpeggios over a double-time groove a minute and a half in. The choruses are really epic and satisfying, especially those parts where the backing chord progression shifts down to the minor sixth. That is so good. Not even getting that whole ambient section with all those fluttering saxophones playing the melodies that were previously played on the synths, and all those wailing operatic voices in the background that give me a mild twinge of like an Orbital Belfast feel. I fuck with all of that. But while we're on the topic of tracks that really take you on a journey, I feel like the biggest elephant in the room is Kool Nuit, the longest track in the bunch at nearly 8 minutes, and boy does this one live up to the hype its length sets for you. At first combining melancholy orchestral string sections with lonely ambient synths, bringing in Kayla Sinclair again in a more directly credited featured role, to deliver a breathy soprano verse in French. Switching over into another progressive electronic section with all these blocky arpeggios of bleeping synths, gradually building up the percussion and intensity even further, getting bigger and bigger and more epic and dramatic as it goes along, adding in simple 2-note vocal refrains in the background and building up more guitars and even more crazy synth layering in the final payoff. I may have a lot of mixed thoughts on so many of these tracks, but this one pretty immediately stood out to me as the best track in the bunch and never fails to impress me through all 8 minutes every time it comes on. Absolutely fantastic track. After that, there's an ambient interlude in Sunny Boy Part 2, which honestly doesn't actually sound that much like Sunny Boy outside of being in the same key. It's a single monolithic synth pad that plays for 2 minutes with some occasional background humming. Though I do appreciate it being here, as I do with all ambient interludes like this that M83 include on their albums. Honestly, the project could have ended there and I would have been perfectly satisfied with it. But we got one last track at the end in Dismemberment Bureau, another particularly meaty 7-minute behemoth, which, while fitting as a closer, I don't think really stuck out to me as much as I would have wanted. The initial hook of "All We Want Till the End of Time," it is one of the more memorable tunes on the album, and there's a satisfying atmospheric bend to everything. Though the heavily vocoded verses that surrounded it aren't quite as melodically gratifying, and past the halfway mark, the track just kind of trudges on and stops progressing outside of getting predictably washed out with synths and effects, and weirdly abruptly stopping at the end. It's a good enough track and isn't made redundant by other cuts here, but it's just not really a cut that I'd feel like seeking out on its own. And that's everything on Fantasy. It's a good album, but it's a bit of a mixed bag that probably could have stood some editing down, and I'm left at the end of it mostly happy with what I got, but also feeling like I'm probably not going to be hanging on to it longer term. I mean, in one breath, I've seen some critics go off on this album for thinking it's more profound than it is, and I don't agree on that point. It may not exactly be a deep listen in any capacity, but I don't think the album thinks it's deep either, or is trying to pass itself off as anything other than what it is. I've also seen complaints about the shallowness of the lyrics, and I was like, oh no, an M83 album has inessential lyrics, whatever shall we do? But at the same time, I do know that Gonzalez and company are capable of delivering even better than this. I'm not as peeved by the predictable safeness of the record as you'd think. I do kind of find their attempts to mine their own history for nostalgia to still thematically line up with what the band has always been about since day one. And I don't just like it for the meta-like novelty of saying that's what it is. I still feel like they went about it in a way that didn't feel cynical to me. Despite the lack of originality, it still feels like an earnest and genuine expression in its own weird way. And I don't think Gonzalez was lying in any of his PR talk around it either. It does feel like this was more meant as like a personal indulgence for him, wanting to explore specific vibes above all else. Not really focusing on songcraft or hooks as much as older albums could, and letting tracks just kind of meander on wherever he wanted, without really worrying about what might be more commercially successful. So, yeah, I mean, I would totally get it if, for you, this was their best album in a long time and a big return to form after possibly being disappointed by their last two projects, as seems to be the case for most fans I've seen. Though I would also totally get it if you thought this project was mid as fuck and added on to that string of disappointments as well. I think it has moments of greatness, the biggest heights for me being Waterdeep, the title track, and of course Kool Nuit. And there are lots of other good tracks, with none that feel like outright clunkers. But the sluggish, endlessly meandering pacing of these tracks and the excessive sameness of the album as a whole don't do these tracks any favors, leading to an album that I definitely enjoyed, but I, again, just kind of don't see myself keeping around longer term. It's good, but it's not their best work, and as such, I'm feeling like a light 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.